Hello and welcome to today's Art in the Spotlight on the Canadian avant-garde experimental filmmaker Betty Ferguson. It's great to have you along. My name is Julian. I'm the Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the AGO, and I'm speaking to you today from land that is the territory of the Anishinaabe Mississauga Nation and was also the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Neutral and Seneca nations through time. And it is with great pride and privilege that we have the opportunity to do our cultural work on this important and historic land. We feel very fortunate to be able to do our work here in this place. Great to have you along today. As we sort of move through our conversation with Munro Ferguson, who I'll formally introduce in a moment, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask a question or make a comment. We'd love to be able to turn to your feedback and questions towards the end of the presentation. It always adds so much to the event, so we please encourage you to participate as the event unfolds. We're really grateful to have the support from TD Ready Commitment. They are our lead sponsor for all the talks and performances that we have been conducting in this series, and we thank them for their generous support of today's presentation. I'm really happy to be joined this afternoon by Munro Ferguson, who was born in New York City in 1960 and studied painting and drawing at the Banff Centre and then philosophy at the University of Toronto. And Munro has a sort of long and distinguished a career in film. For example, as early as 1984, he created Eureka, a comic strip about science, which is syndicated to over 30 newspapers internationally. And in 1994, he joined the National Film Board English Programs Animation Studio, where he wrote, directed, and animated numerous films, including Falling in Love Again, which was the winner of the 2004 Genie Award for Best Animated Short. He's also created, really interestingly, a lot of virtual reality experiences, dome films, and also stereoscopic immersive installations, including the work June, which is an elegy for his close friend and mentor, the artist Joyce Wieland, about whom we'll be learning, I think, a lot more this afternoon. So without any further ado, Munro, I'd like to welcome you in and perhaps you could just say a few words as we get going here on this opening slide, which is a picture of your mother at her editing table, I assume.
Yes, thank you, Julian. Thank you for having me, and hello to all the people out there listening in or watching us, I should say. Yeah, this is my mother. She's editing. She's at her editing table in. This was in Killeen, Ontario, which is in Puslinch Township, not far from Toronto. She's, you can see that she's got, well, anybody who's familiar with 60 millimeter editing equipment, that's a moviola in the center, that's the viewing device. On the left, there is a squawk box where she would listen to the sound. And on the left and on the right, there's the take-up reel and the film reel of the 60 millimeter film that she was working on. And you can't see it, but right in front of her would have been the actual hot glue splicer that she used to make her films. And in the background, you'll see a film screen, and behind her would have been her projector. She didn't have sync sound while she was editing, except through the squawk box. So she wasn't able to run this very simple editing equipment. So to check the film to make sure that everything was okay, she would put it on the projector and play it and watch it on the screen. So, and the kind of films that she was making were called found footage films. It's an experimental film technique, which basically you take pieces of older films usually and splice them together to make a new film. She found most of the source material for her films in dumpsters in New York behind television stations. In the 1960s, when color television was coming in, the local stations threw out all their old black and white prints. And my mom would go around collecting them. And friends of hers would also give her old films that they had. And she bought some old prints as well. So she herself would compare her film practice to quilt making, particularly the making it like patchwork quilts, which are generally made out of scraps of different scraps of material put together. And she also hand tinted her films, as you'll see. She'd use Peerless watercolors, which is a special kind of watercolor for tinting photographs, black and white photographs from the days when there was no color photography. And one of the aspects of her film practice was that, I guess the technical art term would be called foregrounding, which is a term invented by Bertolt Brecht. And it's letting how the film is made be apparent. The materiality of the film is revealed, not just through the hand tinting, but also her cutting techniques, because they were juxtaposing films from totally different stories. And because her technology was so crude, she wasn't able to do A and B rolling. And so every time there's a cut, there's a disruption in the sound. But she kind of made a virtue out of that. And anyway, found films are films that reveal how films are made.
The comparison that you made with quilt making is so interesting to me, because of course as you're describing her approach to filmmaking, especially working with found footage, there is this tactility, isn't there, to the way that she's sort of splicing, resplicing, connecting, and sort of cauterizing almost these pieces of film, connecting them to each other in this sort of newfound sequence that makes a particular kind of meaning when projected.
Yeah, other kinds of collage do that as well. But I think the comparison with quilt making, in her case, is something that relates to her friend here, Joyce Wieland. And because Joyce was also very interested in bringing into fine arts crafts that were usually considered to be women's work. And she was quite a pioneer at bringing that was part of her feminist film practice, was to celebrate art crafts and arts that were until then associated with women. I love this picture of Joyce. Most of the audience is going to know who Joyce Wieland is, as she's one of Canada's most beloved and famous artists. And of course, the Art Gallery of Ontario has a huge collection of Joyce's work, and has hosted several retrospectives of her artwork. Joyce and my mother were very, very good friends. They had a long and close friendship. They were like sisters. And Joyce was really part of the family. When she came to our house often and stayed with us. Both my parents collect art, and so I grew up surrounded with a lot of art, including many pieces by Joyce Wieland, who was a friend of mine as well, and Joyce loved children. And many of the pieces were given that my mother had that were Joyce's paintings and drawings and sculptures were works that were given to my mother as gifts. And other pieces my mother bought from Joyce, particularly when she needed money, especially at the end of her life. My mother supported Joyce in her later years when Joyce was suffering from early onset Alzheimer's.
So their friendship through art, in a way, traversed the different media that Joyce Wieland worked in, I assume. I mean, obviously, film is a strong point of connection between them. We're going to learn more about that in a moment. But presumably they had sort of wide-ranging conversations across a range of different media.
Oh my God! And so, I mean, that was the great thing about Joyce, was that she was a fountain of inspiration and ideas. You sit down at a table with her and have a meal, and she would come up with 12 amazing, brilliant ideas. Some of them would be hilarious, some of them would be sacred, others very profane. She was just a, she was, knowing her was like a roller coaster ride of great ideas, one after another.
Yeah. So
Here's,
tell us,
go ahead.
no, I was going to say, tell us a little bit more about your mother's sort of origins, as it were.
Oh yeah, so here's a picture. Yeah, my mother was born in 1933 in Centralia, Washington. She moved to Alaska as a teenager, about 18, right after high school. She used to joke about it, saying it was a really great living in Alaska back then, and it was in the 1950s, was a really great place to be for a young woman, because there was 10 men for every woman there at that time. And she moved to New York in 1959, and where she married my father. This is a picture from her wedding day. And she said, she told me, she often talked about those first days that first year or so that she moved, after she moved from Alaska, just described it as culture shock coming from the frontier to the big city. It was quite an adjustment for her. So one of the first people that she would have met, in New York, was a very good friend of my father's, experimental filmmaker, Maya Deren. And this is an image from Maya's film, Meshes in the Afternoon, which was made in 1943. And if anybody has not seen this film, I highly recommend that you see it. It's one of the most beautiful, brilliant, experimental dance films ever made. It's possibly the greatest dance film ever made, in my opinion. And it is it's just an incredible dreamlike experience watching this film. Maya had an influence on my life, though I don't have no memory of her whatsoever, because she died in rather tragically in 1961. And I was born in 1960, but she basically is the person who's responsible for my father becoming a filmmaker. She was at the University of Toronto doing a workshop for students there who were interested in filmmaking. My father participated in. My father was studying economics at the time, and Maya was like, "No, you shouldn't be an economist. There's too many economists already out there. You should be a filmmaker." And my father just basically changed his life, like his whole life plan changed because of Maya's influence, and he became a filmmaker and had quite a great career as a documentary filmmaker.
It's interesting to me with Deren. I mean, sorry to interrupt you, but I mean, her films are quite extraordinary, but also her influence. I mean, she wrote a lot about film as well, and published a lot, which I think, her influence to sort of a younger generation through her words and her descriptions of how to make film and how to think of the camera and how to think of the body and how you construct reality through film, I think is so influential, is it not?
Yeah, I think she's an incredibly inspiring figure in the history of world cinema, and yes, my father gives her a huge amount of credit for shaping his way of thinking about cinema as visual storytelling, primarily visual first.
And is that something when you sort of specifically tying this relationship to your father, but how does that sort of permeate into your mother's filmmaking practice?
Well, I think Maya was an inspiration to all experimental filmmakers at the time, particularly women. Because she was such already considered to be a genius, and that's that. But I think her films, that the dreamlike quality of her films is so compelling, and you'll see as we go along that there's a dreamlike quality to my mother's films as well, and which is kind of goes along with the medium of found footage.
Yeah.
So that, because there's these strange juxtapositions that you have in dreams that also you can also have in those kinds of films.
Yes.
So yeah, my mother would have met Maya in New York, but she only knew her for 2 years, and because she died in '61.
Yeah.
Another important figure in the experimental film scene in New York, Shirley Clarke, who's became a very good friend of my mother, and there weren't very many. It's interesting because there were very few women in New York that were part of the experimental film scene at that time in the 1960s. So Shirley, Joyce, my mother, and Maya would have been one of the very few, basically the few that there are there that were in New York at that time, and that they all knew each other was kind of interesting. Just kind of shows us how connected that world was. So yeah, Shirley also was a great teacher. She received an Oscar nomination for her documentary film Skyscraper in 1959. And she's perhaps best known for Portrait of Jason, made in 1967, which is a feature-length documentary about a black male prostitute. And I think, I think Shirley's example, her confidence and her encouragement were very good for my mother in helping her become a filmmaker.
I think in a moment we're going to look at the first sort of clip you want to share from Barbara's Blindness from 1965. But before we sort of hit that, I'm just curious a little bit more about, you showed a picture there of Shirley Clarke holding a camera, and of course Maya Deren also sort of shot her own footage too. But tell me why it is that your mother sort of moves more towards the sort of collaging and the montaging of found footage rather than sort of utilizing sort of early on, as I understand it, her own moving image footage.
Yeah, I think my mother was an editor. And so that was the filmmaking tools that she had. She would do assistant editing, neg cutting.
Yes.
That was one of her jobs.
Yeah.
And so she knew how to do it, and she was a natural at it. So it was her medium, and it was something that it was really Joyce that got her started. So this next film that you'll see, Barbara's Blindness, is a film that the two of them made together. And well, why don't we look at it and then we can talk about it.
Great.
And Mary wished with all her heart that she could come out of the darkness too. And then, one day, a friendly nurse said, "Mary, open your eyes." When an Eskimo... A view from the bridge. You miss.
One day, in a secluded corner of Mike's ranch,
This was to be the battleground. Now, every war produces its hero. And the heart, when the final chapter of a tough...
So yeah, that's a short excerpt, a clip from the film.
I think you certainly see, the year this is made, 65, it's, the mid-60s are obviously a very tumultuous time. You have the passage of the Civil Rights Act in the United States in 64, and there's the atomic bomb there. There's so many, there's female wrestling. It's such an amazing sort of surrealist combination of different components that come together there.
Yeah, it was actually, The Barber's Blindness was made as an anti-war film, and I mean, you're right, it has all those ironic juxtapositions and dreamlike discontinuities, but it was, yeah, it was made to be an anti-war film, and it was shown in screenings to protest the Vietnam War, including the week of the Angry Arts, January 29th to May 5th, 1967. So that, yeah, that was like right at the height of the Vietnam War protests.
Yeah.
And yeah. So there's, I mean, we mentioned surrealism. There's a connection with the medium of found footage. The very first found footage film ever made was made by the American surrealist artist Joseph Cornell, and it was during its first opening screening, which was at which gallery was it? Anyway, I forgot now. The Salvador Dali was in attendance, and Salvador Dali.
Julian Levy, I think it's the Julian Levy Gallery.
Yes, that's right.
Yes,
that's
yes,
right.
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, so Salvador Dali flew into a rage when he saw the film because he thought that Joseph Cornell had stolen the idea for the film from his mind.
Mm. What a line.
Yeah. So this is this is my mom in the 1960s, and in our apartment in New York. And like I said, she made the film with Joyce. This is Joyce from that time period in New York.
Where did they first meet, Munro? Do you know I mean, obviously you were very young at that time, but how did they first meet?
Joyce and Mike, her husband, Michael Snow, moved to New York in 1961. And we were all, and they stayed in our apartment on the Upper West Side. It was a big apartment. Yeah. Back in those days, you could get these big, huge apartments for just a few $100s a month in New York. It's not quite true anymore. So I was 1 year old at the time. I was wandering around, babbling this kind of nonsense language because I hadn't learned English yet. And Joyce and Mike decided that what I was speaking was Tibetan, and that I was the reincarnation of a Tibetan Lama with oracular powers. And so they would read to me the classified ads because they were looking for a loft to live in, and listening to my advice on what loft they should rent. And they did eventually get a loft down in downtown New York, and actually where the World Trade Center was, actually that neighborhood, or it is now today. So here's a picture of Mike from that time period. Actually, my dad took this picture. He's in our house, and Mike, like Joyce, they were very playful in their art practice, and I think they were both an influence on me in the sense that as a kid growing up, I saw that they were using cartoon elements in their paintings, and so I got this idea that comic books were actually art too, and that led to my career as a cartoonist. But yeah, apparently my mother tells a story from those days that Mike would go into our bathroom and write the word poo in tiny little letters on the wall and with pencil, and that to be discovered later, like you'd be like looking at it. And he did this other thing too, like while he was trying to teach me English in his own particular way, and he would like hold up a fork at the table while I was eating, and he would say, spoon.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was trying to, I haven't really recovered since then.
Well, this idea of sort of art and play, and in a way sort of upturning the rules and sort of presenting new rules of the game is sort of part of the kind of artistic strategy that Snow has had through pretty much most of his career. And I mean, that's sort of what you're describing, is it not?
Yeah, exactly. Well, then, and there, my mom, at one point, my mom and Mike were talking, and he was asking about her technique, and my mother said, I make the rules and then I break them. And then Mike liked that a lot. And he basically expanded on that concept. And one of his famous quotes is, I make the rules of the game, then I attempt to play it. If I seem to be losing, I change the rules. And I think that's actually really captures a lot about Mike's approach, kind of almost like Wittgenstein or something like that.
Just coming back to your mother's statement, which I like, I make the rules and then I break them. I mean, did she have, you haven't really referred to her as having sort of formal training. I mean, she worked as an editor, a film editor, but she didn't really have formal school training. So in a sense, whose rules was she breaking? I mean, what was the sort of baseline that she was working in sort of in tension with, if you could say?
Well, first of all, nobody had formal training in filmmaking at that point. There was no universities courses on filmmaking. Everybody learned by doing it. Whether you were or either working on your own as an independent filmmaker or working for other filmmakers and learning the craft that way. It was done through apprenticeships. But yeah, the way my mom worked was basically she would set up a pattern in the film. So you would have some sort of expectations about what was going to happen next.
Yes.
And then she would subvert it. And which is, actually some music works like that too. It's like sometimes, and so, yeah, that's basically what she was talking about, I think.
Mm-hmm. So in part of that, what that means for a viewer is that you're sort of in a, I wouldn't say a constant state of sort of disruption, but you're not allowed to kind of settle into a sort of comfortable way of viewing that the filmmaker is.
The thing is, you do start to settle in, and then just as you're starting to settle in, something happens that surprises you. So that's and that's where the delight comes in. Like, I wasn't expecting that.
Yes. Yeah.
So here's since we're here talking about kisses, that's the main topic of conversation, because that was the film that showed at Studio 54.
Yes, indeed.
I'll show a couple of clips from that next, because that relates to, so you can see a little bit more of her practice.
Great, and we're moving forward essentially a decade here, because Barbara's Kisses is 65 and this is 76, isn't it?
It was made in 76. So this one, it was actually her last film that she completed. So it's in a way it's kind of the most. It shows all of her techniques kind of all in one package. So it's good. It's probably the film of hers has been seen the most.
Yes.
And the way it works is there's a lot of little quick cuts, and then you'd have like a longer scene. Here is one of the longer scenes here.
Chloe?
Yes, George?
I was wondering...
What?
Never mind.
What? Tell me.
Well, I was wondering... You'll not laugh if I ask you.
Laugh? After the lovely day we've had?
Silly. Well, I feel daft talking like this.
What do you want to say?
Well, you see, you're different. I've never met anybody like you before.
Go on.
I was wondering, could you... would you give me a kiss?
So all the shots in the film are kisses. So the difference between what Joyce and Betty did on Barbara's Blindness is that's like all over the place, a whole bunch of different kinds of content juxtaposed, like ironically often. The way that my mother's films, once my mother started making collage films on her own, each one of them was based on an object. Like one of the films is kisses, another one is the telephone film, and the other one is the airplane film. And I'll show you a little clip of each of those.
Yeah. And what do is it known? Let's watch this clip and then we'll watch this clip and then we'll come back.
Okay, so here's another part of kisses.
Great.
So what were you going to ask?
No, I was just going to ask about how your mother sort of arrived at the notion of putting this particular film together. You know, why this subject matter? I mean, these are two clips from a film that has, I mean, dozens of wonderfully sort of interwoven scenes from both silent and classic kind of Hollywood movies. But what is it that made her sort of settle on this subject?
Well, it's one of the, I mean, the kisses are, in the history of cinema, I mean, before you could have sex scenes, the kisses stood in place of more intimate stuff, which you couldn't, you know, according to the Hays Code, you couldn't show nudity or anything else. And so Hollywood and world cinema started to really kind of fetishize the kiss, because that was what stood in for all types of love. And so you'd have wonderful kissing scenes, like fantastic kisses, and the build up to the kiss was always so interested in throughout the history of cinema as well. And so you know, I think she was attracted to the subject matter, of course, because, you know, it's so emotional, but also because there was so much great cinema that included kissing scenes.
Yeah, it's also interesting that her other films, as I sort of understand them, don't have really dialogue, so to speak. Whereas this film, because it is doing precisely what you just mentioned, sort of selecting different scenes through film history, it does actually have a dialogue moving through it that is somewhat surrealist and staccato. But actually, when you add up all the parts together, it does amount to a really interesting transcript in terms of how the kiss or the embrace is negotiated through film over 50, 60 years, or even perhaps even more than that she selected from.
Yeah, it's also interesting. When watching it again, I realized there's a lot of rescue scenes in it. There's a lot of men rescuing women.
Yeah, and it was sort of therefore, in a way, thinking about Studio 54, which this program today is tied to. I mean, this film of your mother's was specifically selected by Karen Bacon, who was an event designer for the club, for a Valentine's Day event in 1979. So it was sort of specifically meant to really function in that context of the club being the nightclub in New York City at that time. And what can you do that is sort of really sort of both wonderfully visual, but also in a certain sense over the top to celebrate Valentine's Day, almost 42 years ago to the day.
Oh, it's the perfect Valentine's Day film. It really is. And I'm happy that Art Gallery of Ontario is going to be showing it online this week, the week of Valentine's Day. So if you see the whole film, you can find it on the AGO website.
That's right. It's at ago.ca, and it'll be it's available to live stream all the way through to the end of this weekend. So if you haven't already seen it, make sure that you do so before the end of the week, please.
So here's an image of me and Joyce in the bottom left-hand corner there. Joyce on the right, she's got a 16mm Bolex camera. It's a wind-up camera, Swiss. They're really great. I love those cameras. And Joyce was a really big part of my childhood, and she had a really strong influence on me when I remember her taking me to the Museum of Modern Art in New York City when I was a little kid around this time, and her getting me to look at the paintings and telling me that each painting was a window into another universe. And I still look at art that way. I still think of art as oh, by the way, that's behind me. That's Joyce behind me. That's one of her paintings.
On the wall there, yes.
On the wall behind me. So what she's doing here is she's filming off a TV set. Yeah. This is around the time. This is right after the assassination of Bobby Kennedy. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that would have been 1968. Yeah. So I would have been 7 then. Right. And the political situation in the United States was horrible at that time. Incredibly violent, and with horrible violent acts of racism which I saw as a child, very traumatic. And for my mom, the last straw was the Hard Hat riot in 1970, which was construction workers attacked student protesters with the encouragement of President Nixon. So it was just like, if you think things are bad now in terms of American politics and violence and an evil president, thank goodness that's over. But there's definitely precedent for this.
Is that what was sort of precipitated in a way your families moved to Canada then around that time, the end of the 60s? Yeah,
that's right. We moved. And so my father's Canadian, so it was easy for us. And I was registered as a Canadian at birth, as was my sister.
Yeah.
And at the time, my father was ready to move to Canada, back to Canada anyway, because he wanted to start a new business, company called Multiscreen, which later became IMAX Corporation. Yeah. So we were all pretty glad to come back to Canada.
Yes, I can imagine. One just sort of small sidebar here. I think it's great, this picture that shows Joyce Wieland sort of filming the TV, because, this, there's sort of elements of this that relate that particular filmmaking strategy that relate to the likes of Bruce Conner, who gets so much more publicity and if you like, recognition for his work. And of course, Joyce's films and your mother's films have been significantly underappreciated, I think, and yet they are utilizing a lot of the similar techniques and putting them together in very, very effective and significant ways, I think.
Well, thank you. So yeah, this is a clip from Telephone film. I'll show it and then we can talk about it.
Hello? Manny, is that you?
Yes? Baker?
Está?
Yes? Hello?
Hello? Hello?
Scotland Yard? Yes? Two suspects, yes?
Scotland Yard? Flash ground, hold on.
Wonderful. And these, if I'm right in understanding, your mother actually worked as a telephone operator for a period. Is that right? So
yeah, that was her first job in Alaska. And in those days in Alaska, being a telephone operator also include operating radio as well, so for radio calls. So yeah.
So she's sort of translating that lived experience into this wonderful patchwork of fabulous footage that relates to the.
Yeah, it's funny. As a kid, I never made that connection that the personal connection between my mom and telephones and her filmmaking practice. But then when I'm looking at it again, I realized, they really were personal films.
Yeah, and it presages this is a bit of a leap, but bear with me, but it presages in an interesting way Christian Marclay's piece on the 24-hour, the clock, which is about the notion of time, of course, through a 24-hour period, but that repetition of the clock in different scenes. And it ends up being, this is on a smaller scale, understood, but it ends up being a really fascinating exploration of the way that a particular motif is represented through the medium of film over time.
Yeah, well, the clock is just an amazing art experience. Interesting, Markley also made a film about telephones in the 1990s, I think, which was just called Telephones. And it's very similar to my mother's film, and it even has some of the same shots in it, coincidentally. So
is it known? I mean, do you know if he had any prior knowledge of your mother's film, or is that still a question?
No, and I only stumbled. I mean, the telephones is actually part. I live in Montreal, and I was at the Museum of Art, Contemporary Art here, and I saw the film. I saw it there, and I was amazed. Just the, you know, I think it's just a coincidence. Yeah. There'd be no connect unless Markley saw the film, telephone film, but.
We might be sort of laying a pathway there for a film history student. That
actually, yeah, I have to say that I think my mother's film is better. I mean, maybe I'm biased, but I find her editing technique is a lot more playful than Markley's. Like Markley's just like shot.
Yes.
My mother's like tinting things and looping things and really and really having fun with it.
Yeah, I know we sort of, as we're a little bit pressed for time now, so let's keep moving and talk a little bit more about life in Toronto and the sort of your mother's sort of involvement with the film world here.
Yeah, so this is a picture from 1973 when she was first. Her films were started screening in feminist film festivals, and this is the Women and Film Festival in 1973. My mom's in the bottom left-hand corner. Right above her, standing behind her, standing up is Shirley, her friend Shirley Clarke, who's wearing a top hat. Shirley always wore a hat. And I don't know who the two people are in the middle, but on the right-hand side is Shirley's daughter, Wendy Clarke, who was a pioneering video artist from the 60s and 70s. And I remember as a little kid, going to a workshop that Wendy gave on video art making. That she had put on it during the event. So yeah, here's the airplane film, which my mother also made in 1973. Should I just play that clip?
Yeah, please. Yeah, please.
So interestingly, there's a connection between airplanes and my mother's time in Alaska. Then my mom had her own airplane in Alaska, which she flew. Back in those days, there weren't a lot of roads in Alaska. And so flying, it's not unusual for people just to get in a plane and fly someplace on their own, the way you would drive a car. One time my mom was flying her plane. It was a single engine propeller plane, of course, and near Mount McKinley, which is the largest mountain in the United States. And the engine stalled and the plane started going down. And my mother said that's the only time in her life that she prayed. All of a sudden she believed in God.
Yes.
Because she was going to hit this mountain. But then fortunately, one of the good things for propeller planes is that when they go into a dive, the engine can restart because the wind of the dive can turn the propeller around, and so that's what happened. Yeah. And so my mother was able to fly back to the closest landing strip, and and she never flew that plane again. But yeah, that was another thing. Watching airplane film again, it's kind of a dark film. There's a lot of airplanes in storms. There's airplane crashes in it. It's got a little bit of a scary side to it. And there's a lot of repeated scenes where you'd see the same sequence over and over and over again, like maybe 3 times, cut
Yeah.
like a little bit different, or maybe a little bit longer each time. But it kind of feels a little bit like you're in a dream that you can't get out of. Like
I was just going to say that sounds very much like the sort of the repetition that can preoccupy those sort of more difficult dreams that one has from time to time, right? But you can't shake the image; it just sort of stays with you and represents itself. I know we've just got a couple of images to look at now, but there's a really an interesting question, also a great comment that's come from folks who have tuned in. So my colleague Georgiana has asked, did Betty and Joyce also know Anna Mendieta in New York City?
No, well, maybe. I don't know. I don't remember the name.
Okay. Okay.
I don't remember her talking. So yeah, I don't know. Hi, Georgiana.
And then really interesting comment from one of our viewers who says, did you know that the first group of workers to stop working when the Winnipeg general strike was called was the entirely female group of telephone operators? It was the shift change and they all left the premises to go on strike. Isn't that great?
Amazing.
Yeah, yeah.
No, I did not know. That's a great story. You can imagine how paralyzing that would be.
Yes, yeah. So this is what's so great about when we have an informed audience, tuning in, that you get the most fabulous sort of questions and observations that ties to, provides a new point of entry into a film like that. And it's interesting that both the telephone film and the airplane film connect to sort of direct lived experiences that your mother had, and she sort of recasting those experiences through the medium of film with her particular artistic vocabulary, which is, as you've explained, I think very effectively this afternoon, quite unique.
And I imagine kissing was part of her lived experience as well.
Yes, of course.
All right, well, I'll show you a little picture of my mom today. There she is. This is in her home in Montreal. Unfortunately, both Shirley and Joyce died of Alzheimer's in 1997 and 1998, respectively. My mother still talks about Joyce all the time, which isn't surprising because there's paintings of Joyce all over the house.
Yeah.
And Kisses, which she made in 1976, was the last film that she completed. She had several films on the go, like partially completed, that she never finished. Other things in her life have gotten in the way.
And just before you hit play on this, I wanted to ask, so in the last clip from Airplane, am I right in saying that what we saw there in a few of the little passages was the hand tinting that you referred to at the top? Exactly, right? So
yeah, and you see here in this frame here, there's a little red circle. I don't know if you can see it right.
Yes, absolutely. That's sort of what prompted the question.
Yeah. Okay, so are you ready?
Yes, please.
Okay.
What was that?
Oh, just the usual hired thugs and the usual powerful black sedan, but never mind about them. I'll get them later. Are you all right?
I'm all right. In your note, in the flowers, you said there was something you wanted to ask me?
Yes, there was. I'm not very good with words, Miss Lane.
Lois.
Lois. But, excuse me. This will probably be a little expensive, but it's worth it.
What are you doing?
Squeezing little diamonds into one big one. See? Now, what I wanted to ask you was, will you marry me?
Because a good man nowadays is hard to find. Where's that man? A good man is hard to find.
great note on which to end. There's a couple of great questions that have come in. I know we're pressed for time, but I think they're important, especially this first one, which is interesting. Might you or someone else perhaps finish the films that Betty didn't? Is that something that, is
that's what when she stopped making films, she said, "Oh, you'll finish them, Munro. You can finish them all."
Yeah.
The problem with that is that she really had her own unique editing style, and I don't think it would be very difficult for somebody to really capture perfectly her way of filmmaking. It's very personal. So, but her film collection is still. We donated it to the Canadian Filmmakers Distribution Center, and so they're holding on to that material. So it's still possible for somebody to do that. Maybe I will do it myself someday, but that's a tough one to those are big shoes to fall into, to step into artistically, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I mean it's also just quite challenging. I would have thought, just difficult, even maybe emotionally, to do that with your own parents' work, isn't it? Is it not? Isn't that the sort of challenge also to do that? To try and do that?
Yeah, this project here, going over her old films and going through her files and verifying the stories that she said about her life was actually really fun for me. I do enjoy that. So yeah, I'm fans of both my parents' work. I'm actually in the process of interviewing my father on his film practice as well. So I'm really interested in capturing their legacy of both my parents.
Yeah, and I think that sort of recording of the oral history is a really critical piece of creating a record that sort of is clear for today, but also can be utilized by scholars and interested film historians down the line.
Yeah, especially when it comes to artistic practice, because that's really hearing it directly from the artist is like there isn't really a substitute for it. And in my father's case, because he's been interviewed by a lot of people about the invention of IMAX and the history of the company and stuff like that. But nobody's really actually sat down with him and interviewed him about his actual filmmaking practice. And it's interesting, his stories are hilarious too, all the adventures he had. But that's another talk some other day.
Indeed. There's a couple of wonderful comments that have come in here, and I think they sort of illustrate so richly, how our lives are these days in COVID. We're separated from each other, yet we're connecting online in the way that we are this afternoon. And there's a really nice message from someone called Haley Stewart, who says, "Hi Munro, my name is Haley, and my partner and I are so lucky to be living in Betty's old house in Killeen. It has been really great to learn about her art and her rich history here. I'm wondering, what was Betty's last project? In a way, you've mentioned Kisses as being that, or is she working on anything today? I mean, how can you characterize how she is today?"
Well, the films that she didn't finish, one was called Old Film Hands. It was going to be all about hands, and another one was called Film Quilt, and I think it was going to be a little bit more like a little bit more freeform, like Barbara's Blindness. Yes. And she also had another project called Doors, which was all about people going in and out of doors. And so they're kind of half. I have them. They're half done. They're not finished. Yeah. They weren't finished in her opinion anyway.
Yeah. There's also another wonderful note from one of your mother's neighbors in Puslinch. So Andrew Johnson, who says, "Hello there, and please let your mother know that we miss her here too." So obviously, it's not just her work that's left a huge imprint on people over the years, but also who she is as a person.
Yeah, in my later years, in her later years, my mother became very involved in the community around her, the Puslinch township, and did a lot of genealogical research and research into the history of the area. So
I think we've learned in just less than an hour here that the depth and breadth of your mother's contribution, and how importantly how she intersected with this really important sort of constellation of Canadian artists who who made a huge impression in New York, or in New York at a moment of great sort of creative ferment, and then came back to Canada and continued to do really important, influential work here. So thank you very much for sharing your obviously your knowledge and your passion and your insights to your mother's work. And please give her the very best from all of us tuning in. I think I can speak on behalf of all of our guests today. Wish her well, and please tell her how much her work continues to inspire today.
I will. Can I just say one last thing?
Please.
You mentioned my film, the film that I made June, which is an abstract animated stereoscopic film about Joyce. And it's going to be showing at the Obero Arts Center here in Montreal as an installation from April 10th to May 15th. So anybody in Montreal wants to see that, they can.
Great, and I think that even we think that probably sort of inter-provincial travel should be possible by then, we hope. So it's great to have something additional to look forward to and to bring us to Montreal. So thank you very much for that, Munro, and look forward to our next conversation. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and be safe and well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.